Welcome to the Codependency Inside Out podcast with your host, AJ Mahari, who has 32 years experience working with clients with BPD or NPD relationship breakup recovery, Cluster B and family of origin, and codependency recovery. This podcast will provide in-depth and up-to-date information all about codependency to increase your understanding, answer your questions, and explore the challenges of recovery. To purchase and book a session or sessions with AJ Mahari, please visit ajmahari.ca.
Codependency has, at its roots and causation, childhood trauma. And there are many different aspects, levels, meanings, and experiences of what is meant by trauma, because it's not the same for everybody who has codependency. Codependency is a formidable mental health challenge, and as such, it is trauma-focused and trauma-based coaching and counseling and therapy that is the way to heal and recover from codependency, not Codependents Anonymous, which is those 12 steps in the Codependent Anonymous program are the co-opted 12-step Alcoholics Anonymous, and it's an old, ancient, outdated modality for people with codependency to actually be doing the depth of recovery that will indeed help you to heal your core childhood trauma and core childhood woundedness. So many people experience trauma as children, and few were given the resources to cope with it. And in fact, in certain family dynamics that create from family of origin many different degrees, levels, and types of trauma, hurt, woundedness, for those who will develop codependency, it's these adverse childhood experiences, and there isn't the support of emotionally available parents, or there's some miscommunication there, there's some codependency or other systemic breakdown in family of origin and in the relationships that are so crucial to children in their family of origin, and what are the dynamics going on in the family of origin. So there aren't resources given to cope with it in childhood because the family of origin is dysfunctional. And so the system and what children go through in their family of origin then becomes, to one degree or another, wounding, adverse experience, or outright and more obvious trauma. And these traumatic or wounding experiences in family of origin in childhood do have incredibly long-lasting impacts on people throughout the life cycle if they don't get into treatment. People with codependency and the relational difficulties that codependency really has at the heart of it is correlated highly for people to end up in relationships with people that have other relational, often trauma-based relational difficulties with relating or connecting, but perhaps more often than not in the same way as people with codependency. So what does that mean? Well, it's the high correlation between people with codependency getting into relationships with people with the patterns of borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, and or people who are diagnosed with either BPD or NPD. And these long-lasting impacts of this childhood trauma to adverse experience to woundedness in childhood includes chronic physical health conditions that an infant or young child or someone in childhood may have experienced, depression, dissociative disorders, substance abuse, and that could be a parent with substance abuse. But we generally look at it now that people with substance abuse issues often have other mental health, diagnosable mental health challenges, often such as borderline personality disorder in particular, or other personality disorders. Self-harm, distrust in relationships, poor emotional responses, and either maybe complex post-traumatic stress disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is for people with codependency from what's happened in your family of origin in your childhood. And many people grow up in these dysfunctional families of origin and they are not aware consciously of how they've been impacted and how the impact of the core trauma in childhood that is the manifestation of codependency, how that's going to really impact and affect your ability to get into healthy relationships. Because for those who have codependency more moderately or severely, people more or less end up with cluster Bs or other personality disordered individuals, people with dependent personality, etc. And they do not get into healthy relationships. They get into one-sided, very painful situationships. And one reason why childhood trauma is usually or more often family-centered is abuse, neglect, domestic violence, or even just divorce and fighting occur in these families of origin. Often a parent or parents are not emotionally available. You might think you got everything you needed. Nice house, clothes, toys, a happy grandmother, good aunts and uncles. But often there's such dysfunction in the dynamics of these family systems in which people will suffer the woundedness and the trauma of codependency. And people with codependency in their family of origin to one degree or another, with one parent or another or some other family member, often do not experience positive, healthy role models that are going to help you to develop a positive, healthy relational style and attachment style, both of which people with codependency do not know, do not have healthy relationship styles or healthy attachment styles. And childhood trauma may lead you to feel helpless and dependent. There's parentification, there's infantilization, many things that happen to people that experience this woundedness in childhood in many different ways and for many different reasons. And when children feel helpless or dependent or are parentified, this, quote, emotional incest, unquote, that is extremely impacting and is a causative factor of codependency as well. This is the reality that you're not getting validated or seen or heard, and you're not learning how to develop mutual reciprocal relating because it's not being modeled to you. So at the other end of the spectrum, really, of codependency, in and of itself, a traumatized child may grow into an adult, more often than not does grow into an adult, that needs to care for or have someone depend on them, providing the other side of that codependent relationship, what was wounding and traumatizing and adverse experience in childhood. The trauma-bonded codependent, this is going to be something that originates in childhood often for people with codependency. Not all codependent relationships are abusive, although all are unhealthy and harmful. In some cases, though, the codependent is emotionally or physically abused by the other person in the relationship. This is the absolute reality of being in a relationship with a person with borderline personality or narcissistic personality, and maybe some other personality disorders as well. If you have ever felt ashamed or weak for being unable to leave your abusive relationship, you are likely experiencing a trauma bond. And a trauma bond, it's a coping mechanism for a traumatic situation with your codependency in which you feel loyalty to and dependence upon your abuser. And then you have somehow basic from childhood on misunderstanding, misperception that is so painful that your loyalty and dependence on an abuser is you loving them and is them loving you, when there is no love where there is abuse. There is no respect, there is no mutuality, there is no reciprocity. there's something more or less known as mystified, quote, love, unquote, which I will talk more about in upcoming episodes of this podcast. So a person that you could be in relationship with treats you badly, but you go back over and over to a pattern of being, you're trying to be loving and caring from what you know and understand about that. And then that person gives you some breadcrumbs, be it a borderline or narcissist, or maybe somebody without a label or a diagnosis, but they're going to be very relationally damaged individuals in their own right. And they'll give you breadcrumbs. They'll tell you what you want to hear, and then you believe that. And okay, good, everything's all right, or everything's all right again. And then you go back and you re-experience the same things, and you have this denial, this false hope. These are repetition compulsion patterns externalized out from the childhood wounding experience, or the traumatic childhood experience. And so it's extremely difficult to leave the person with BPD or NPD, or you get ghosted or discarded. It's extremely difficult to leave that door closed. It's extremely difficult for a BPD relationship breakup or a narcissistic personality disorder relationship breakup for the codependent to accept that, to understand that the breakup, the ghost, the discard, the confusion, the pain, the abuse you've suffered, that all of that is signaling to you from maybe the other, but it signals that this is over. This is it. They have ultimately abused you to the point of throwing you to the curb and blaming you for what's happened in that relationship. So the borderline or the narcissist projection and blame that you did everything that they did. Well, that's not the case. But here's the thing. So then there's many, many reasons, right? And it's not really, quote, addiction, unquote. There's an element of that only so far as it depends on if people have other addictions or a real addictive personality. But for everyone, it's not about addiction. It's not about love addiction necessarily, but it is for many. It's not about sex addiction, but it can be for many. It's not driven by what limerence really is, means, and how painful that is for everyone, but it is for many with codependency. It's hard to break free from the trauma-bonded reality of these most unhealthy, toxic, traumatic, abusive relationships that codependents get into, and then deny and are having that unconscious repetition compulsion experience and cycle of really needing to be loyal and care for this abuser, as you likely to one degree or another did for a parent or another family member in childhood, where your original codependency comes from, and the trauma that we know, the trauma response that we know that codependency is. Trauma bonding can occur even without, well, certain types of extreme abuse or overt abuse. And when the relationship is codependent, or one person in the relationship, or in the case of people with BPD and NPD, they have codependency as well. So we're looking at two codependents, one without a cluster B personality disorder and one with, often, in these relationships, these trauma-bonded relationships. So even if when the relationship is codependent, and make no mistake, the relationship with cluster Bs is codependent, but not exactly in the same kind of codependency that we could say would be two-way, or what a person with codependency without a personality disorder is going to be experiencing, and how you're going to be feeling, and what's going to be motivating how you're so loyal, and you believe it's so much about your love for the abuser, and you believe somehow that abuser loves you back, when really they're just abusing you and using you. So even without overt abuse, so for example, the quiet borderline, perhaps the covert narcissist, which are not one and the same, by the way, you develop an attachment, a very insecure, often fearful, avoidant, very unhealthy attachment and loyalty to somebody who is absolutely not good for you and who's going to be wounding and further traumatizing you. So breaking trauma bonds, very difficult, but not impossible. But you're not going to go to Codependence Anonymous now, are you, and think that you're going to be breaking a trauma bond? Codependence Anonymous is an outdated, old, dysfunctional modality that has uses the 12 steps of what they call Codependence Anonymous, which are the 12 steps, exact same ones, co-opted from Alcoholics Anonymous. So if you don't have a substance abuse issue, if you're not an alcoholic or a drug addict, then this 12-step methodology and modality and dysfunctionality and the idea of sponsorship and all the slogans and all these people with all these issues, none of them being expert in these areas of how to help people heal and recover. Codependence Anonymous is anathema to recovery from codependency. What that really requires, what that really needs, and how trauma-informed and trauma-based recovery codependents need to heal not only from codependency, but to break the trauma bonds that go back in one way or another for most people with codependency to the family of origin and its dysfunctionality and your unmet needs and root of your woundedness and codependency, but also to be able to heal and recover from the trauma and the abuse and the cycles of that are fused with, quote, love, unquote, that have nothing to do with healthy love in relationship to the borderline or the narcissist. And treating codependency involves recognizing and changing harmful and damaging relational and relationship patterns. This is not going to happen for you in Codependence Anonymous or generally in any 12-step program. You need an expert. I'm out here to work with you. I'm an expert in this area. You need a mental health professional. And if I'm not the person that resonates with you, you need to get into an expert coaching or counseling situation, therapy, to heal and recover from the relationship trauma and dynamics and the trauma bond, and to heal and recover from codependency and your family of origin woundedness, in which you have, to various degrees, people have a wounded inner child, and a lot is happening from your unconscious, from the wounded inner child, repetition, compulsion cycles externalized out from that level of your beingness, where there's a separation between yourself and that wounded inner child. And there is a false self in codependency. Not as formidable as in BPD, which is not as formidable as in NPD. The most effective way to work at this recovery from the relationship and that trauma and your family of origin trauma and other aspects of this which have affected your development as a human being, so you don't have a healthy relationship to and with yourself when you have this core rooted trauma known as codependency from your family of origin and childhood. So to get to the root of the problem, there is a process that needs to be trauma informed. So you need to work with somebody like myself who understands how to help people heal from early childhood adverse experience, woundedness, or trauma. It's trauma-based informed processes and modalities and methods that help people to heal and recover, not the codependent 12 steps. I really want to stress that. You need to be able to process in, like I said, a coaching or counseling type of way, modality and methods and means there, with someone like myself, with expert knowledge in what all of these dynamics are about, and what makes a trauma bond so hard to break free from, and how do you do that in a process of healing and recovery. So you need to process past or ongoing or recent traumas. That's not going to happen in a 12-step program, not to the depth that it needs to happen. For the individual traumatized focused therapies begin the process of reliving, reframing, and healing from those experiences in a way that Codependents Anonymous and other 12-step groups cannot possibly really help you with. To the depth, degree, and successful nature of what you really need to process and learn more about to absolutely really heal the trauma bonds and the woundedness that is codependency. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, among other methodologies and means and ways of processing this, which I use that as well as other methodologies. Motivational interviewing, experiential therapies, milieu therapy, and other types of therapy can help you face up to a difficult past in a safe and supportive setting, not a 12-step group. Getting treatment for the individual with trauma is essential. For most people with codependency, the family system is such, and or you might have a cluster B parent, or two in some people's cases. The family system is such that the don't talk rule is very much enforced without it maybe even ever being mentioned. Don't air your dirty laundry. You will have been so affected by a plethora of negative core beliefs which you might not be consciously aware of right now, so that often for people with codependency there is no road back to a therapy or a treatment or intervention that can help you in terms of it being the family system that goes and gets help. Often you as a codependent are going to have to do this on your own. I advocate really it's the healthiest way to do it anyway. Because if you have a mother and for whatever reasons, maybe she's kind of more the wounding source for you as a codependent, it would be best if your mother sought her own treatment and healing and recovery, or your father, or a sibling, or maybe each and every one of your family members on their own. So I suggest that people with codependency really look for their own healing and recovery process, because often many people in the family of origin and the dynamics that are playing out for each individual family, though there are patterns across many dysfunctional families that lead many a person to end up having the trauma response known as codependency. So again, seeking your own healing recovery process is much better than trying to work it out with family of origin or with family of origin therapy, many of whom you will never even get to acknowledge that there's a problem or to want to join you in a healing and recovery process. But in your healing and recovery journey, you need to learn how to let go of what become control needs because you have so many unmet needs. How to find that agency over yourself so that you won't feel out of control, whether consciously or unconsciously, so that you won't have those kind of control needs, which are part of the externalizing out for people with codependency to rescue and fix and change others, to try to provide and get you what you need and your needs met, and to find emotional safety. Because people with codependency are a little bit more controlling in their efforts to give and rescue, etc., and overgiving than is often consciously realized. And please don't hear that as a judgment statement or that there's anything really, quote, bad, unquote, about you. Because those control needs and that control asserted often unconsciously by people with codependency was learned in childhood, and it's you trying to keep yourself emotionally safe. So people that have enabled you or you enabling someone else now need to learn to let go of control and to set boundaries that you really need. And a lot of those boundaries are going to be emotional, and they're going to go to the wounded inner child and many different layers and iterations of depth within one's own personality and relational functioning. Everyone learns to communicate better in these processes of healing and recovery, and you can learn more about the trauma that you've really been through. I help clients identify that all the time. What does codependency really mean for you in your life, and what are the roots? How did you end up being a codependent? And I would also say it's really important for people with codependency to learn more about changing all the unhealthy behaviors that codependency you got as a result of developing codependency from childhood woundedness or trauma, and how to change the unhealthy behaviors and interpersonal dynamics that you're still carrying forward from your family of origin. So when people have codependency, which is a trauma response, various levels for different people with codependency, then what's likely happening is that your family of origin, that family system, is struggling because of trauma and unhealthy patterns in the family of origin to begin with, and then you enter the family of origin and it's dysfunctional. And so it's really difficult for you to know what's happening to you. Sometimes it's really overt and obvious what trauma that even people with codependency will suffer. And sometimes it's not that obvious at all. And I've had many clients come to me and say, but I had a great childhood. My parents really loved me. I don't know what people are talking about when they say, this dysfunctional family and what. And then, on the other hand, and so we have to process that. We have to work through that. I help clients to work through that to identify. Maybe there's some woundedness. Maybe there was something that happened to you in your childhood that wasn't a parent's fault or that wasn't maliciously done to you, but you still had unmet needs that were wounding you to the level of you having developed a trauma response of codependency. And make no mistake about it, if you're in a relationship and you're recycling on and off or something with a person with BPD or NPD or whatever the case, you are definitely in a trauma-bonded situation, and it's very difficult to break out of that without seeking your own healing and recovery process by working with an expert in this area, like myself if I resonate with you. Trauma and codependency are interrelated. It is trauma or adverse experience or neglect or some other difficulty in childhood that creates codependency. So they come together in that regard from family of origin. And the most central consequence of going through trauma is damaged relationships. So trauma or adverse experience to varying degrees and levels in your family of origin, you then have codependency. You go forward in your life, you may or may not feel encumbered by this. You may or may not understand consciously at all about this. But the consequence of going through trauma and living with, to one degree or another, wounding or damaged relationships in your family of origin, growing up that way, being hurt, produces patterns, right? Relational patterns that aren't healthy. And you will not even have a healthy relationship to them with yourself. It drives a lot of why people with codependency can't break the trauma bond with a borderline or a narcissist, because many are afraid to be alone. Many might not think they're afraid to be alone, but they might have a fear of being alone. And there's many other elements too, like negative thinking, the negative core beliefs, the inflamed internal critic in those with codependency, how judgmental and critical you can be, maybe sometimes on others, but more importantly with codependence, often on self. And if you don't understand why you're having all these relational difficulties, or why is it that you just can't find that healthy relationship, or why is it that maybe you're fearing intimacy and closeness in your own right and maybe not consciously aware of that. There's so many layers and really moving pieces, and it's a multi-layered picture of what is codependency, and not only overall, but more so for each individual experiencing it and the unhealthy relational patterns that codependency really defines or is made up of. So even if one person in any family system or in any relationship has been through trauma, the impact ripples outward to anyone or all people close to the person that's experienced trauma. And in the case of a borderline or narcissist, yes, they're very traumatized individuals, and they traumatize others close to them, and that's going to trigger your codependency. In fact, many people don't even realize they've had codependency all their lives until they get triggered by a person in a trauma bonded relationship with a borderline or a narcissist. You have already experienced, if not direct trauma. I've had clients where their parents had many issues and fought all the time. Sometimes to the point of violence, not always. Sometimes with substance abuse, not always. And this is one example of how you will develop codependency, say based on even just mom and dad fighting often, and it's scary and it's wounding, and they're so focused on each other and so busy fighting with each other, and then maybe they talk to you about it, one parent does or the other one doesn't, and then they're leaning on you because they don't get along. This is how parentification often happens. But the thing is, you're going to get the codependent woundedness if even your parents don't directly traumatize you. They traumatize you, say, by fighting with each other all the time. Then the codependency can form based on the trauma and the unmet needs and lack of emotional safety, wherein, say, if you have two parents fighting all the time, often a lot, it's very scary when you're young, then it's you have experienced secondary trauma in your family of origin. And the idea that people can go forward with codependency and the patterns thereof and all that that means and how it impacts relationships, even with somebody healthier, it doesn't really produce a healthier relationship for people with codependency, because the relationship will start veering into an unhealthy pathway of the patterns within the codependent, if you're with somebody who's not a cluster B, for example, that will harm yourself and somebody that might be healthier, and maybe like if you're not with a cluster B. Childhood trauma, complex trauma, and current or recent trauma all contribute to codependency, and codependency being one half of any relationship that a codependent enters, more or less, and what that means is there isn't going to be a healthy attachment or connection from the person with codependency, or certainly not with a borderline or narcissist, and maybe even not somebody with codependency who's with maybe somebody who's not borderline or narcissist or narcissistic. Because often I have clients describe to me the relationships they've had before. A recent one with someone with BPD or NPD, or maybe comorbidly both. And they will report that those relationships were much different. The breakups weren't as difficult or as painful. So what happens in those type of relationships where you're not having your codependency and your childhood trauma or woundedness triggered as often as you will in a trauma-bonded relationship with a cluster B, for example, there's still issues that you're carrying why the relationships don't last and work out, even if you've been with somebody who's reasonably healthier and certainly not cluster B. So I hope that this was helpful, because this is a lot of what people need to understand, and you might not know. You might not believe that you have codependency. You might not understand how you could have got codependency because of the lens through which you still see your childhood, and or maybe the way that relationships are with a parent today, or parents today, that they're not, quote, that bad, unquote, or that they might be a little more functional, but you're still carrying the woundedness of something that wasn't the same with a parent often as it might be now in childhood, and that matters. So, and I'm just going to do this quick overview here again. What is codependency? Because there's many different ways to put this. A codependent relationship is an unhealthy one. So that means even when you're with a borderline or a narcissist, you see, there's a component of that trauma bond and unhealthy relationship and traumatizing relationship that isn't all about the cluster B. And I'm not saying that it's the bigger part of the relationship or to negate any of a borderline or narcissist traumatizing and abusing you, but you're not coming into that relationship with any kind of healthy, secure attachment, etc. So there's a codependent component that adds to what's going to happen to you from the borderline or the narcissist. It's not your fault. That's not what I'm saying. And so a codependent relationship is an unhealthy one. It's one-sided. and you will end up with a one-sided partner, or if you're not with a partner that is one-sided, like a borderline or a narcissist, then it's going to be the one-sided issues that are coming from your woundedness of codependency that you may not have known about prior to being with a cluster B. But many people that I work with and have worked with for over 33, well, almost 33 years now, they don't realize that in previous relationships, why they ended had a lot to do with the person with codependency's patterns, fear of intimacy, insecure or avoidant, fearful, avoidant, different attachment styles, and that this is an issue for people with codependency even before you get to the trauma and the issues of borderlines or narcissists and getting into those trauma bonded relationships and then trying to get out of them. And so in the codependent aspect of trauma bonded and abusive relationships, where usually the codependent is loyal to the abuser and believes they are really loving the abuser while self-abandoning self, which isn't healthy love, and you're not getting any love from the abuser. But there's a strong denial in codependency to where people believe perhaps that they are. It's an erroneous belief, though, that you're getting loved by an abuser. And so what happens then is one person is relying on the other to meet most of their needs. This can be a person with codependency relying on somebody healthier to meet most of their needs in a sort of upside down type way. But with the cluster B relationships for people with codependency, it's going to be the person with BPD or NPD that's going to be relying on you to meet all of their needs, rescue them, fix them, change them. And you're going to have patterns within you from childhood to where this is the way that you have learned that you're supposed to relate to someone else, that you need to give in order to be worthy of receiving, which isn't true. And so what can be included in a relationship where you're giving and meeting most of the other person's needs, and the other person, just by way of lack of personal responsibility or having BPD or NPD, for example, will encourage, in a way, just by not doing anything for themselves, increased enabling by someone with codependency, because it becomes so compelling, and it's a repetition compulsion cycle for people with codependency. And you continue this in spite of a partner or a loved one's damaging behaviors toward you. And so in this trauma bonded, these unhealthy relationships, it can include substance abuse, impulsive behaviors, overachievement or underachievement, or many other behaviors or lifestyle choices that are negative, harmful, and really traumatic and unhealthy. Every relationship is unique, but there are some commonalities that many people in codependent relationships or with codependency in relationships and trauma bonds experience. Chief among them is low self-esteem. You may feel unworthy of others. Some people feel, quote, like a loser. That's the internal critic. Many people will describe that to me. I'm not calling you that by any means. People will feel, with codependency, feel unlovable, guilty, just, no matter what, feel ashamed, and you even project outward an appearance of confidence, but that you don't really feel inwardly. People with codependency lack boundaries. Codependents generally have poor boundaries, if any boundaries at all in certain areas, and not only emotionally, so poor boundaries with affection or emotions, but also just poor boundaries in all the areas in which to be healthy, we need boundaries. And people with codependency have a need to please and take care of others. And you actually learned that in childhood, by the way. It was inculcated and trained into you in a way that was harmful and created codependency, among other things. So this is not like something you're actively, consciously choosing in your adulthood right now. Many people aren't even aware of it, and then they become aware of it. But people with codependency have this need to please and take care of others. It's hard for codependents to say no. For some people with codependency, it's outright impossible for you right now to say no. Because if you say no, you feel like you're going to be a bad person. If you say no, you feel like other people are going to feel badly about you, talk badly about you, think horribly about you. If you say no, you feel guilty. Just think about how damaging and wounding that is to yourself. And also, people with codependency can have high sensitivity. You may react you may overreact to emotionally charged situations, and situations where somebody else is really emotionally charged, yelling or screaming at you or not wanting to talk to you, and the communication feels impossible, and you're like, but the situation doesn't warrant all of this. What's happening? Codependence reverting to logic a lot, because lots of people with codependency are not familiar with their internal emotional landscape. And logic, by the way, can be a bit of a block to recovery, but that logic that many default to with codependency, trying to figure out what is this person doing, what just happened here, that also comes from childhood, and it is a defensive strategy to try to continue to cope with what you with the abuse you're getting that you might be denying is abuse, and with these trauma bonded relationships that absolutely make no sense. You have a partner that's emotionally reactive and yelling and screaming at you, and there's no communication that you can't get them into a conversation that's reasonable or two-way or going to change or rectify anything. And so, you're sitting there going, well, I don't know what's going on here, because like whatever I started to talk to this person about doesn't warrant all of this. And then you may have sensitivity and overreactivity to that the more that you are bombarded by that abusive, overreactive, blaming you, projecting out, that splits of devaluation that borderlines and narcissists do in their own different ways, etc., motivated for different reasons as well as overlapping reasons at times. And you're just going to be sitting there. Often people are in a fawn freeze codependency response to a borderline episode or narcissist abuse, a borderline episode of abuse as well. So, and also poor communication. People with codependency, even if you can come from a very logical place and be very articulate, very focused on what you would like to talk about, how you're feeling, what just happened, what that person did, what, how to build, how to repair a situation that's gone off the rails. But some people with codependency have not as much ability in that arena as others, and some will have their own poor communication deficits that aren't the same as those of people with BPD or NPD. Many people with codependency absolutely struggle to express how they feel or what they want. But you can be in that logical place of, this isn't making any sense here. I need this person to change, that they're doing this, so that they can hear me when I say that, so that they can get that I need this or that. It just doesn't really work in that attempting to communicate with somebody that isn't seeing you and isn't hearing you, which is triggering your codependency and your repetition compulsion cycles of externalizing out and feelings that you may or may not feel of almost utter desperation to get heard and get seen, because you're trying to repair something. Only you're trying to repair something in someone else, and you're ignoring what you need reparation from your childhood and to help your wounded inner child, and what you need to heal to become an individuated, independent individual as opposed to somebody with codependency. So these are just what I just named there, low self-esteem, lack of boundaries, a need to please and take care of others, high sensitivity, perhaps some poor communication of your own, but not knowing how to deal with the lack of communication and responsibility taking from often a borderline or narcissist. These are some common characteristics. This is why I include these in a lot of these podcast episodes, because there's so many ways to put this and so many different depths to go to with it to help people understand. But there are many more difficult emotions, denial, and there is many more issues and difficulties with intimacy, obsessing over relationships, and the need for control within codependency, as I've touched on some of that. But it's even much more deep than what I've said here, and it will remain much more deeply within people with codependency without you being able to understand it unless you get into your own healing and recovery process. And I'm out here to work with those of you that I resonate with. But please make no mistake about this. Codependence Anonymous is not the way to heal from a BPD or NPD relationship breakup, the trauma bond that you can't break without getting into a healing recovery journey, working with someone who's an expert in this area like I am, and many other people are, you cannot expect to go to Codependence Anonymous. I mean, you can go to Codependence Anonymous, but I'm telling you, I'm advocating for you to think about what a waste of time that is. Other people on YouTube think it's the way. It is not the way, because it is not. People at Codependence Anonymous might be expert in their own experience, dysfunctional experience, maybe some kind of changes they've been able to make in their life, but they are not trauma experts or trauma recovery experts. And it's a dysfunctional system, and like I said, it's dilapidated and outdated for the way that codependency was defined. That was why people went to Codependence Anonymous decades ago. So I suggest that you really give that some thought. If you hear anywhere that, oh, you need to go to Codependence Anonymous or a 12-step group, and then that's going to be more effective than therapy or working with someone like in a coaching process or whatever we call that, or whatever it is, a same kind of process. But somebody like myself who can work with you, because I'm an expert in this area, because I've got all the lived experience with this as well, and having had codependency very severely myself in the past, and having changed that, and having healed that. And what does that even mean? And is that perfect? And does it mean it entirely goes away? But again, please consider what I'm saying, that whether you go to a 12-step group or not, it's not going to be near enough. You need to work in a healing recovery process where somebody is going to work with you from an expertise point and a vast knowledge base, and also lived experience, like I also have. Vast knowledge base of trauma-informed recovery, and a process to help you to be able to break the trauma bond, to understand the origins of the trauma bond, not just in the cluster B relationship, but from family of origin. And what does that look like, and what does that mean? And is that applicable to everybody with codependency? Maybe not in the sense of trauma bond sounding so like only it's defined as, I've talked about it before, right? What it's defined as, and it seems like it's all black and white. But there are degrees and levels of all of this. So if you doubted it, if you're not sure yet, if you're still in denial, please know, if you take nothing else away from this podcast episode, that codependency is very linked to trauma, and that people with codependency are very susceptible, if not doing repetition compulsion, of developing trauma bonds with borderlines and narcissists in particular.
You have been listening to the Codependency Inside Out podcast with your host, AJ Mahari. To purchase and book sessions with AJ, please visit ajmahari.ca.